Alex, great news that we've been shortlisted for the Staff Development Forum, Developing Excellent Practice Awards. Let's start this podcast, this very special podcast, by you telling us why we created the podcast and how we arrived at the position that we're in today.
Yes, we're really pleased about being shortlisted for the award. And it's great to be able to share a little bit about what we've been doing with the podcast. So why did we think about doing this podcast? Well, it was because through our conversations, we became really aware that there was a vast range of excellent practice taking place locally across our institution. However, that local knowledge was rarely being shared outside of the departments or even the teams. And that was both with professional services and with academics. And often academics were talking to themselves within their departments, or professional services colleagues were talking to themselves within their team. But actually having those conversations, even across faculties or across the institution, weren't taking place. So the aim of the podcast was to provide a context to share some of those local experiences and practices with a view to supporting colleagues to explore new ideas, provoke development of practice, and to drive the education innovation across our university, which fits really, really nicely with the university's strategy.
So the Academy is designed as a centre of excellence in the development of leadership and management, education, research and professional practice. And we work with partners across the institution and beyond to support the delivery of Liverpool's strategic objectives. By drawing together the core elements of practice development in this way, we're able to create innovations and to capitalise on the synergies between our teams. This allows us to significantly enhance the opportunities for professional learning and personal development that we make available to individual staff, to teams and to the wider organisation. Now, the Developing Practice podcast is a fantastic example of this approach delivering genuinely innovative development. By focusing on the concept of practice development and drawing on the expertise of the Academy's organisational and academic development teams, plus the wealth of experience of our guests, the podcast has been able to unpick critical lessons of real value to a wide and diverse audience in higher education. Indeed, this value is captured in the real success of the podcast so far, with over 3,000 downloads from 44 countries across 6 continents, and that's just the latest count. Anecdotally and personally for me, the fact that the release of each episode is now a fixture in the professional routines of so many colleagues has been really lovely to hear.
One of the key priorities of our organisational development agenda is creating a culture within which staff can take responsibility for their own learning and development and create a habit of reflective practice and have opportunities to learn from each other both inside and outside of the institution in order to develop their practice and to drive performance. The podcast enables us to do this through the use of the classic OD device of storytelling and providing a medium through which staff can find their voice, share practice and inspire others to do the same.
And then how have we seen the project develop over time?
It's been great to see how well received the project has been and how it's developed over time. One thing that we really wanted to continue was that conversation after each podcast. So one thing that we did was to develop reading lists that were specific to each podcast. So we spoke to the guests that we talked to develop a list of resources, whether they were websites or journal articles or book chapters as well, for colleagues to look at if they wanted to take their learning further. So we developed that resource for colleagues to dip into, and then we asked them to feedback their experience in terms of their reflections and their learning from the podcast, but also from the reading that took place afterwards. And then as a result of that, we then thought about, well, how do we continue that conversation in person? So we developed the idea of this journal club where we would meet every month to talk about a book chapter or one of the podcasts itself or a research paper, face-to-face, synchronously online to further explore the insights into these kind of ideas and thoughts that we were having.
Colleagues have fed back that they really appreciate that they can take their learning further after each podcast by engaging with the associated reading list linked with each recording. They also appreciate having the opportunity to talk through their reflections with other colleagues at the Journal Club.
Yeah, and they were really good, weren't they? And we were getting a nice little community of people who were coming together and they were willing to share some practice. And then the pandemic happened.
Yes.
And then everything changed. So we started then very quickly to develop the podcasts using Teams and Zoom. And we had to do that really rapidly. We had to change our style because it's very different from being in a room with somebody and just having a conversation. But we overcame that, and I think for the better, because the podcasts were then able to be used as a resource for people who are going through a very difficult time. It was a welcome distraction for people, I think.
It was, and we saw people using it in a different way, didn't they? So
Yeah.
kind of pre-COVID, people were using it on their commute, whereas actually once we were all locked down, it became, as you say, a really valuable resource to support colleagues in terms of dealing with the pandemic itself, and having something to draw from.
The Developing Practice podcast provides an excellent opportunity to respond to the needs of academics at every career stage, from those new to teaching to the ongoing practice development of more experienced colleagues. The focus of the podcasts on conversations with colleagues from across the institution and beyond, on a range of topics often linked to the development of academic practice, clearly supports our priorities. The podcast provides a platform that enables academics to benefit from the rich experiences and practices of the guests involved.
Great. And Matt, can you tell us how the podcast has engaged a collaborative approach?
Well, for one, me and you come from very different backgrounds. I mean, I'm an organizational developer with experience of online learning and organizational change and things. And obviously you're an academic developer with a specialism in development of learning and teaching practice in higher education. So we did come at it from a slightly different angle. And I think that actually really helps the podcast for its breadth of conversation that it has. And it really helps with the types of colleagues that we've managed to get on the podcast. We've got colleagues from professional services and academics. So I think there's a bit for everybody in that. And that collaboration has made the podcast more the better.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it's been great working with you, actually, because you ask questions that I would never think to ask academics, and I guess vice versa as well, because you're coming from it from such a different angle, which is great. And that was the aim of the podcast, is that people would start to have those conversations from different disciplines, from different backgrounds, so that we could encourage the sharing of best practice. One of the ways that the podcast has been collaborating and supporting others is through special episodes. So one of the things that we did was releasing special episodes with the keynote speaker of our pedagogic research conference. So again, we could build on that conference and share, wider disseminate some of their work with a view to raising the profile of the conference itself, as well as sharing best practice.
The range of guests that we've attracted over the first 2 seasons has been phenomenal and incredibly diverse, and has enabled different voices to be heard. So from Holly Ridings, the Chief Flight Director of NASA, who inspired particularly our female scientists to aim high and obviously had links with our Athena Swan agenda, to participants in our internal Springboard programme, who shared how participating in that programme had enabled them to take control of their own development and their own careers, to a special season of 5 podcasts for Black History Month, where because of its impact, we use the podcast medium to raise awareness of Black History Month activities and also to demonstrate the university's commitment to tackling racism as we embark on our journey to achieve the Race Equality Charter. The success of these means that we're already exploring the possibility of other special editions, for example, International Women's Day next year. For me, the real strength is in the collaborative nature of the podcast between organisation development and academic development in the academy, and the possibilities that we have over time to continue to flex and extend the podcast medium, for example, through our upcoming journal club.
Another example of our collaboration is with our colleagues in researcher development. They run an annual event called Making an Impact, which is designed to support the development of research staff across the institution. And every week, as part of that event, which ran for the period of a month, we released a couple of podcasts speaking to a whole range of people, again, with a specific remit of developing those research members of staff.
Yeah, and that reminds me, we also, over a specific month for the Black History Month, we produced 5 episodes where we had guest speakers as well as guest interviewees on the podcast from various backgrounds in Merseyside, but obviously all coming from a Black ethnic background. So that was a really important thing to do. There's a lot of benefit in that, and it's another example of using the podcast to promote different stories and different people with different backgrounds.
Absolutely.
It was a great pleasure to contribute to Alex and Matt podcasts. It gave me the opportunity to disseminate further my practice, which I was awarded a National Teaching Fellowship for. I was able to share my journey to becoming an NTF, which now the podcast is an informative resource for colleagues who would like to apply for the award. I have also found the other podcasts very useful to inform my own practice.
Great. And what does success look like, and how have we measured it?
Well, getting people to attend some CPD sessions was troublesome. We had some sessions where we'll have a room full of people. This is before the pandemic. And then we had some sessions where, we couldn't really get the numbers that we really wanted. So I guess at the beginning, success was, could we get 100 downloads of the podcast? That changed quite quickly. So as of today, we have 3,063 downloads. It's been listened to from listeners from 44 different countries, covering ages from 18 to 60 plus. So yeah, success changed along the way. I think it's fair to say in terms of the numbers.
Yeah, I think you're right. And alongside that, we had some really positive qualitative feedback. At the end of each podcast, we encourage people to tweet in and let us know their learning and their reflections on each podcast. And one of the quotes that I really liked from some of the kind of evaluation that we did was a colleague who said, learning from other people's experiences is invaluable in the fast-paced context of HE. This podcast introduces lots of different ideas on a variety of topics and provides lovely stimulus to reflect on our own practice. And I just thought that was a really nice kind of summary of a lot of the feedback that we've been having from people. So yes, success in terms of numbers and numbers of downloads, but also the impact that it's having on people's experiences.
Hi, just a quick thank you for the wonderful resource you've produced with the podcast series. It's been a great way to connect with other people across the institution, hearing what other people are up to. It's also been a really good point for me to consider my own practice in relation to everyone else, and to consider how I can work towards a better research environment and community across the institution as well. So thank you for that.
It was great to be asked to be part of the Developing Practice podcasts, and I enjoyed my chat with Matt and Alex and sharing my practice within the institution. But through social media, especially Twitter, and the reach of those podcasts, it meant that was shared much more widely beyond my profession, beyond the institution, and I really valued the chance for that to happen.
So I'm really grateful to both Alex and Matt for inviting us on to the Developing Practice podcast. We discussed our Learning and Teaching Fellowship for HiPi, the community-based open source initiative for coding across the university. We had a lot of interest afterwards from colleagues and peers who wanted to take the active learning methodologies that we were using and put them into their own sort of initiatives. And also it was just a pleasure to sort of discuss informally what we were doing. I think it really did help us crystallize in our own minds sort of the narrative for the project and the history of it as well. So thank you very, very much for that. It was an absolute pleasure.
So we're a year into the podcast now with over 30 episodes published. If you were to give some advice to a colleague in another institution who is thinking of doing something similar, what would that be?
Well, we've learned loads from the experience. One of the key things that I've learned is the value in exploring creative and flexible means to support colleagues to develop their practice. I think you mentioned earlier that we had been running these kind of face-to-face seminars, and sometimes they were really, really popular, and sometimes they weren't so popular, and we had very, very low numbers. But actually, we wanted to respond to that, and we wanted to build on that experience. And so therefore we decided to do this podcast. And we found that actually being creative and flexible and trying something new and building on our previous experiences has really paid off. So I would challenge people thinking about something like this is to really explore those creative means. What about you, Matt? What would you pass on to colleagues in a different institution thinking about doing something similar?
We had a few guests on the podcast who, when we asked them for their tips, they said something similar, and that was, if you've got an idea and you've thought through something that you think can really make a difference, then don't let your insecurities over it put you off doing it. And I think that's something that I've definitely picked up from doing this podcast. It is an excellent way to reach people. It really does democratize access to development. So, but it could have been really easy to say, oh, it could be too difficult. It could be too time consuming with the amount of editing and things like that. And actually, it's been an absolute joy to do.
So as a collaborative development tool, as a key element of our digital offer, which was hugely beneficial during the COVID-19 pandemic, and as a mechanism to lever additional opportunities for learning, such as the associated reading list and the journal club, the podcast has been a true success. We're extremely proud of the podcast, of Alex and Matt, and of all the hard work that sits behind it. And it's fair to say that we're really excited to see where they'll take it next.